The room fell silent, as if the world itself held its breath. Eleanor Grayson, 96 years old, stood at the head of the dining table, her frail hands gripping a folded piece of paper that trembled slightly in the candlelight. "I'm getting married," she declared, her voice steady, her eyes blazing with a fire that defied her age. The announcement landed like a thunderclap. Her family children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren sat frozen, forks hovering midair, their faces a gallery of shock, confusion, and something bordering on disbelief. Eleanor's daughter, Margaret, 72, let out a nervous laugh, assuming it was a joke. But Eleanor's gaze didn't waver, and the room's silence deepened, heavy with questions no one dared ask. Eleanor had always been the family's anchor, the one who held them together through wars, losses, and the slow erosion of time. Born in 1929, she'd lived through the Great Depression, watched men walk on the moon, and buried 2 husbands. Her life was a tapestry of resilience, woven with threads of joy and sorrow, and now, at 96, she was stitching a new chapter that no one saw coming. The paper in her hand was a letter, written in elegant cursive, from a man named Arthur Hensley. He was 94, a retired botanist who'd spent his life studying rare orchids, and he'd proposed to Eleanor under the sprawling oak tree in her garden just 3 days ago. The family dinner had been planned as a simple gathering, a chance to celebrate Eleanor's recent recovery from a bout of pneumonia. Her sprawling Victorian home in upstate New York, with its creaking floors and rose-patterned wallpaper, was filled with the warmth of roasted lamb and the chatter of 3 generations. But Eleanor's announcement shifted the air, turning the cozy evening into something electric, unpredictable. Margaret, ever the pragmatist, was the first to break the silence. "Mother, you're serious? At your age?" Her tone carried a mix of concern and incredulity, her brows knitting together as if trying to solve a puzzle. Eleanor smiled, her wrinkles deepening with a kind of mischievous wisdom. "Margaret, at my age, I've earned the right to do exactly what makes my heart sing." She unfolded the letter and began to read aloud, her voice carrying the cadence of someone who'd told stories for decades. Arthur's words were poetic, speaking of love that blooms late but fiercely, like a desert flower after rain. He wrote of their shared evenings at the community center, where they'd met during a lecture on heirloom roses, and how her laughter had reminded him of his youth. The younger one's grandchildren, like Emily, 28, and her brother Sam, 25, exchanged glances, their initial shock giving way to curiosity. Emily, a journalist with a knack for uncovering hidden stories, leaned forward. "Who is this Arthur? Tell us about him, Gran." Her tone was gentle, encouraging, but there was a glint in her eye, as if she sensed a tale worth telling. Sam, ever the skeptic, crossed his arms. "Is he after your money, Gran? People can be opportunistic." Eleanor's laugh was like wind chimes, light and unburdened. "Oh, Sam, Arthur's got more money than I do, and he spent most of it on greenhouses and charity. He's a man who loves life, not wallets." She went on to describe Arthur, his wiry frame, his hands calloused from decades of tending plants, his eyes that sparkled when he spoke of the world's beauty. They'd spent months talking, first about flowers, then about life, and finally about love. He'd proposed with a single white orchid, its petals delicate as tissue paper, and she'd said yes without hesitation. The family's reactions began to splinter. Margaret's husband, George, a retired accountant, started muttering about legal implications: wills, estates, healthcare directives. "Mother, have you thought this through? What if—" Eleanor cut him off with a wave of her hand. "George, I've thought through more in my 96 years than you've had hot dinners. I'm not planning my funeral. I'm planning my wedding." The room erupted in a mix of laughter and gasps. The great-grandchildren, ranging from 5 to 15, were delighted, their giggles filling the air as they imagined their great-gram in a wedding dress. But Margaret's face remained tight, her mind racing with worries about her mother's health, her legacy, and this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere. She excused herself to the kitchen, ostensibly to check the dessert, but really to gather her thoughts. In the quiet of the kitchen, Margaret found herself staring at a framed photo of her parents from 1950, her mother radiant in her first wedding dress, her father beaming beside her. The memory of her father's death, 30 years ago, stung anew. How could her mother, who'd mourned so deeply, open her heart again. And at 96, it felt like a betrayal, not just of her father's memory, but of the family's carefully preserved image of Eleanor as the eternal widow, the matriarch who'd sacrificed everything for them. Back in the dining room, Eleanor continued answering questions, her voice steady, but her eyes occasionally drifting to the window, where the garden lay bathed in moonlight. She spoke of Arthur's life, his travels to Borneo to study orchids, his quiet heroism during World War II, his loss of his own wife a decade ago. The family began to soften, drawn in by the romance of it all, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Emily, sensing her grandmother's joy, decided to dig deeper. "Gran, can we meet him? Maybe tomorrow." Eleanor's face lit up. "He's coming for tea tomorrow afternoon. You'll see he's not just a story, he's real." The promise of meeting Arthur shifted the mood again, curiosity overtaking doubt. As the evening wound down, the family dispersed with hugs and tentative smiles, but Margaret lingered, her heart heavy with questions she couldn't yet voice. The next morning, Eleanor woke early, her hands trembling not from age but from anticipation. She chose a pale blue dress, one she hadn't worn in years, and pinned a small orchid brooch to her collar. The house buzzed with preparations, Emily setting out teacups, Sam reluctantly mowing the lawn, the great-grandchildren drawing welcome signs. Margaret, still wrestling with her doubts, watched her mother move with a lightness she hadn't seen in years. It was as if Eleanor had shed decades, her steps quick, her smile unguarded. When Arthur arrived, he was exactly as Eleanor had described, tall, wiry, with a shock of white hair and eyes that twinkled with mischief. He carried a potted orchid, its blooms vibrant against the gray of his coat. The family gathered on the porch, their curiosity palpable, but before Arthur could speak, a new figure emerged from his car, a woman in her 60s, her face kind but guarded. "This is Clara," Arthur said, his voice warm. "My daughter." The unexpected arrival of Clara was like a pebble dropped in a still pond, sending ripples through the family. Margaret's eyes narrowed, sensing a complication. Emily's journalist instincts kicked in, her mind already spinning questions. And Eleanor? She simply smiled, as if she'd known Clara was coming all along. Clara's presence shifted the afternoon's rhythm, her quiet confidence commanding attention. She was a botanist like her father, Arthur, her hands stained with the faint green of plant sap, her eyes carrying a mix of warmth and wariness. "I've heard so much about you, Eleanor," she said, her voice soft but deliberate, as she extended a hand. Eleanor took it with a smile, but Margaret, standing on the porch, felt a knot tighten in her chest. Who was this woman, and why hadn't Eleanor mentioned her? The tea party unfolded in the garden, under the sprawling oak where Arthur had proposed. The table was set with Eleanor's best china, the air scented with lavender and the faint sweetness of the orchid Arthur had brought. The great-grandchildren darted around, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the adults' cautious exchanges. Arthur was charming, regaling the family with stories of his travel show. He'd once slept under the stars in the Amazon, chasing a rare flower that bloomed only at midnight. Emily was captivated, scribbling notes in her journal, while Sam, still skeptical, watched Clara closely, as if searching for a hidden agenda. Clara, for her part, spoke little, her gaze often drifting to her father and Eleanor. There was a tenderness in how she adjusted Arthur's scarf when a breeze swept through, but also a protectiveness that didn't go unnoticed. Margaret, pouring tea, caught Clara's eye and felt a flicker of recognition, a daughter's instinct to guard her parent, just as Margaret guarded Eleanor. It was a silent acknowledgement, but it did little to ease Margaret's unease. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor and Arthur shared glances that spoke of a private world, one the family was only beginning to glimpse. They talked of their plans, a small wedding in the garden, with only close family and a few friends from the community center. "No fuss," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "Just love and flowers, and maybe a little music." Arthur nodded, his hand resting lightly on hers. The gesture was simple, but it sent a pang through Margaret, who excused herself to refill the teapot, her hands shaking. In the kitchen, Clara followed her, offering to help. The two women stood side by side, the clink of porcelain filling the silence. Finally, Clara spoke. "I was skeptical too, you know, when Dad told me about Eleanor." Her voice was low, confiding. He's been alone since Mom died, and I thought maybe he was chasing a memory. But then I saw them together. She paused, her eyes softening. Your mother makes him feel alive again. Margaret's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to say that Eleanor was too old, too frail, too everything. But Clara's words echoed her own buried longing to see her mother happy, not just surviving. How do you know it's real? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara smiled faintly. Because he smiles like he did when I was a kid. Like he's found something worth living for. The conversation was a twist Margaret hadn't expected, a crack in her defenses. She returned to the garden with a new perspective, watching Eleanor laugh at one of Arthur's stories, her face alight with a joy Margaret hadn't seen since her childhood. But the moment was fleeting. As the family gathered for a group photo, Sam pulled Margaret aside, his voice low. I looked up Arthur online. He's got a past, Mom. Not all of it's good. Sam's words were like a cold wind, chilling the warmth of the afternoon. He showed her his phone, where a quick search revealed an old article from a local paper. Arthur had been involved in a legal dispute years ago, something about a failed business venture and unpaid debts. It wasn't damning, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt. Margaret's protective instincts surged, and she resolved to confront Eleanor later, away from the others. The tea party ended with promises to meet again, Arthur and Clara leaving in a flurry of hugs and goodbyes. Eleanor stood on the porch, waving, her orchid brooch catching the fading sunlight. But as the family cleaned up, the mood shifted. Emily, sensing the tension, tried to lighten it by asking the great-grandchildren to draw pictures of the wedding. Their crayons flew, sketching Eleanor in a flowing gown, Arthur with a flower crown, and a garden bursting with color. It was a vision of hope, but Margaret couldn't shake the unease Sam's discovery had stirred. That night, Margaret sat with Eleanor in the living room, the fire crackling softly. Mother, we need to talk about Arthur, she began, her voice steady but firm. Eleanor's eyes met hers, unflinching. I know about the article, Margaret. Arthur told me everything years ago. He made mistakes. Who hasn't? Her tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it. I'm not a fool. I'm choosing this. Margaret's arguments faltered. She wanted to protect her mother, but Eleanor's certainty was a force of its own. The conversation stretched late into the night, touching on love, risk, and the courage to live fully, even at 96. Margaret left the room with her doubts softened but not gone, her heart caught between fear and admiration. The next morning, Emily proposed a family meeting to plan the wedding, sensing it could unify them. She suggested inviting Arthur and Clara for dinner, a chance to ask questions and build trust. The idea sparked debate. Sam wanted to dig deeper into Arthur's past, while George fretted about logistics. But Eleanor's enthusiasm carried the day, and plans were set for a dinner that weekend. As the week unfolded, the family prepared, each member grappling with their own feelings about Eleanor's decision. Emily interviewed Arthur for a feature she was writing, uncovering stories of his resilience and kindness that softened her skepticism. Sam, meanwhile, kept searching, his protectiveness bordering on obsession. And Margaret began to see her mother not just as a matriarch, but as a woman still chasing her own happiness. The dinner was a tapestry of tension and hope, woven under the glow of Eleanor's chandelier. The dining room, with its faded wallpaper and polished oak table, felt alive with anticipation, as if it knew it was hosting a moment that would linger in family lore. Arthur and Clara arrived promptly, Arthur in a tweed jacket, Clara with a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked herself, their scent mingling with the aroma of roasted chicken. Eleanor was radiant, her laughter spilling like sunlight as she guided Arthur to his seat. The family watched, some with warmth, others with guarded curiosity. Emily, ever the mediator, steered the conversation towards safe topics: Arthur's love of botany, Clara's work preserving endangered plants. But Sam's eyes were sharp, his questions pointed. So, Arthur, he said, cutting into his chicken, tell us about that business deal in the 80s. The one that went south. The room stilled, forks pausing midair. Arthur's smile didn't falter, but his eyes flickered with something: regret, perhaps, or resignation. Fair question, he said, setting down his glass. I invested in a friend's greenhouse project. It failed, and people lost money. I paid back what I could, but it took years. Not my proudest moment. His honesty was disarming. and even Sam leaned back, momentarily silenced. Clara jumped in, her voice steady. Dad spent a decade rebuilding his reputation. He funded scholarships for botany students to make amends. Her words carried weight, and Emily scribbled them down, her journalist's instincts humming. Margaret, watching Arthur closely, saw the way his hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from the vulnerability of bearing his past. The conversation shifted, but the undercurrent of doubt lingered. George, ever practical, asked about the wedding's legalities. While there be a prenup? Eleanor laughed, her voice cutting through the tension. George, I'm 96. If Arthur wants my collection of teacups, he can have them. The room erupted in laughter, the great-grandchildren giggling loudest, their innocence a balm to the adults' unease. Then came the twist no one saw coming. Clara, who'd been quiet for much of the dinner, cleared her throat. There's something you should know, she said, her eyes meeting Eleanor's. I didn't just come to support Dad. I came to ask Eleanor something. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound bouquet journal her mother, Arthur's late wife, had kept. Mom wrote about love, about how it's never too late to find it. I think she'd want you to have this, Eleanor. The gesture was a bridge, connecting past and present, and it shifted the room's energy. Eleanor took the journal with trembling hands, her eyes misty. Clara, this means more than you know, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret, watching, felt her resistance crumble further. Clara wasn't just Arthur's daughter. She was a woman honoring her mother's memory while embracing Eleanor's place in her father's life. The dinner continued, the mood lighter but not without its edges. Sam, still wary, pulled Clara aside later, asking about her mother's journal. Clara shared stories of her parents' love, how they danced in their garden even in their final years. Eleanor reminds Dad of that joy, she said. I was skeptical too, but love doesn't lie. Sam nodded, his guard lowering, though not entirely gone. As the evening wound down, the family began to plan the wedding in earnest. Emily suggested a local string quartet. The great-grandchildren insisted on helping with decorations, and even George offered to handle the budget. But Margaret remained quiet, her mind caught between her mother's happiness and the nagging fear of losing her to this new chapter. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Eleanor and Arthur spent hours in the garden, choosing flowers for the ceremony, roses for love, orchids for strength. Emily's article about their story went viral, drawing attention from local media and even a national outlet. Strangers sent letters, touched by the idea of love at 96, and the family found themselves swept up in a narrative larger than themselves. But not everyone was on board. A distant cousin, Helen, arrived unannounced, her disapproval sharp as a winter wind. She'd read Emily's article and felt it painted Eleanor as reckless, tarnishing the family's reputation. You're making a spectacle, Eleanor, she said, her voice low but cutting. What will people think? Eleanor's response was calm but firm. Helen, I've spent my life caring what people think. Now, I care what I feel. Helen's arrival stirred old family tensions, reminding Margaret of the expectations that had always bound them. She began to see her own resistance as part of that legacy of fear of change, of losing the mother she'd always known. Late one night, she found Eleanor in the garden, staring at the stars. Mother, are you sure? Margaret asked, her voice breaking. Eleanor took her hand. I've never been surer. Love isn't just for the young, Margaret. It's for the brave. The conversation was a turning point, not just for Margaret, but for the family. They began to rally around Eleanor, each member finding their own way to embrace her choice. Sam, still cautious, offered to vet the wedding vendors, ensuring no one took advantage of his grandmother. Emily dove into the logistics, her enthusiasm infectious. And the great-grandchildren, with their boundless energy, turned the garden into a canvas of paper flowers and fairy lights. As the wedding day approached, the family's doubts gave way to a fragile unity, built on love and the courage to let Eleanor write her own story. But questions lingered. Would Helen's disapproval cast a shadow? And what secrets might Arthur's past still hold? The morning of the wedding dawned golden, the garden bathed in light that seemed to hum with promise. Eleanor stood on her porch, her white dress soft as a whisper, an orchid tucked into her silver hair. At 96, she was a vision of defiance against time, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that only comes from choosing love over fear. The family had transformed the garden into a dreamscape, roses and orchids woven into arches, fairy lights twinkling like stars brought to earth. The great-grandchildren ran through the grass, their laughter mingling with the notes of a string quartet warming up. But beneath the celebration, a current of unease lingered. Helen's sharp words from days before echoed in Margaret's mind, and Sam's quiet vigilance hadn't eased. Even Emily, usually unflappable, felt the weight of the day's significance. Arthur arrived in a simple suit, his smile wide as he took Eleanor's hand. Clara followed, carrying her mother's journal, a quiet reminder of the love that had paved the way for this moment. The guest's family, friends from the community center, and a few curious locals drawn by Emily's article filled the garden, their murmurs a soft backdrop to the ceremony's anticipation. As the officiant began, Eleanor and Arthur stood beneath the oak tree, its branches heavy with memory. Their vows were simple but profound, each word carrying the weight of lives fully lived. "I promise to love you, not for the years we have left, but for the moments we create," Eleanor said, her voice steady. Arthur's eyes glistened as he echoed her, his voice rough with emotion. "You've given me a reason to bloom again." The family watched, some with tears, others with tentative smiles. Margaret, seated in the front row, felt her heart shift. She'd spent weeks wrestling with doubt, but seeing her mother so alive, so certain, melted her resistance. Emily squeezed her hand, whispering, "She's happy, Mom. Really happy." Even Sam, standing at the back, softened, his arms uncrossing as he watched Arthur place a ring on Eleanor's finger, a simple band with a tiny orchid engraving. But the day wasn't without its shadows. Just as the officiant pronounced them married, Helen stood, her voice cutting through the applause. "This is a mistake," she said, her tone sharp but trembling. "Eleanor, you're throwing away your legacy for a fantasy." The garden fell silent, guests exchanging uneasy glances. Margaret's breath caught, her instinct to protect her mother surging, but Eleanor stepped forward, her presence commanding. "Helen," she said, her voice calm but unyielding, "my legacy isn't in what I leave behind, it's in how I live. I choose love. I choose Arthur." Her words were a quiet thunder, and Helen, faced with Eleanor's resolve, sat down, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. Clara, standing nearby, placed a hand on Helen's shoulder, a gesture of understanding that softened the moment. The ceremony continued, the tension easing as the quartet struck up a waltz. Eleanor and Arthur danced, their steps slow but sure, a testament to the strength of their bond. The family joined in, the great-grandchildren twirling with abandon, Emily swaying with a cousin, even George attempting a few steps. Margaret watched, her heart full, realizing that her mother's courage had rewritten their family story. As the evening unfolded, the garden glowed with laughter and music. Emily's article had drawn a small crowd of well-wishers, some leaving notes of congratulations in a guest book. One note, from an anonymous stranger, read, "Thank you for reminding us that love has no age." It brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, and she tucked it into her pocket, a keepsake of this improbable day. But the twist that sealed the day came from Clara. During the toasts, she stood, holding her mother's journal. "I was wrong about this wedding," she admitted, her voice steady. "I thought Dad was chasing a dream, but he and Eleanor have shown me that love is the dream worth chasing." She turned to Eleanor, handing her the journal. "This belongs with you now. Write your story in it." The gesture was a final bridge, uniting two families through shared loss and newfound hope. Margaret, watching, felt the last of her doubts dissolve. She joined the dance, taking her mother's hand, their laughter mingling as they moved together. Sam, too, relented, offering Arthur a handshake that spoke of grudging respect. As the night drew to a close, Eleanor and Arthur sat beneath the oak, their hands entwined, watching the stars. The family gathered around, their voices a chorus of love and acceptance. Helen, still quiet, lingered at the edge, her presence a reminder that not all hearts change at once. But Eleanor's joy was a beacon, guiding them toward a future where love, not fear, would lead. The wedding wasn't an end, but a beginning, a testament to the courage it takes to live fully at any age. Eleanor's story, and Arthur's, would ripple through the family, shaping their own choices, their own risks. And as the last guests left, the garden seemed to sigh, holding the memory of a day that proved love could bloom even in the twilight of life.